Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Abigail Amajola. Toby, you are on mute. Sorry, everyone. We are working out some technical difficulties. Welcome to November 4th. Our show is about the day after the presidential election, the day after Donald Trump is soundly defeated. It's our hope that, on this day, much of America will focus on not only how to rebuild and repair what he has done, but also reimagine the country. And so we've done several of these episodes already. We focus usually on one topic. And this topic today that we're going to talk about is our challenges related to climate change. How much damage has Donald Trump done with his climate denial administration? What can be repaired, and what might we have lost as opportunities to address the climate crisis? Toby, you are still on mute. So let's see. Toby, if you scroll on your image, let's see. I'm going to see if I can put you.
Now, am I unmuted?
You are perfect. Yes, okay. That's great.
Sorry about that.
No worries. So Toby, can you talk to us about the types of guests we have today?
Yes. So we're every show we look at one topic that should be a central point of discussion on November 4th, the day after the election. We looked in past shows at the corruption of the Justice Department and the trampling on the rule of law with Congressman Steve Cohen, who's chairman of the Constitution Subcommittee of Judiciary and a leader of Common Cause. We've looked at what happens if Trump doesn't leave with the author of a book called Will He Go? This is really perhaps the most important topic of all, however, and that's climate and climate change and how much time we may have lost with the Trump carnage and damage to the environment and the trashing of science and so forth. So we're lucky to have two really great guests today. One is a leader, a climate activist with a sister organization of 350.org called 350 Action. And the other is a former mayor of the biggest city in his state, in Connecticut. And also, more importantly, maybe, the chairman of the Climate and Jobs Task Force with the U.S. Conference of Mayors. So, Abby, you might want to introduce our guest and we'll get rolling.
Yeah, so and that's Natalie Mabane. She's a policy director at 350 Action, and they are focused on civic engagement and electing climate champions. Welcome, Natalie. And Bill Finch is the former mayor of Bridgeport, Connecticut. He held office from 2007 to 2015. Welcome, Bill. So I'm going to start off by asking Natalie our first question. So we're going to assume, and this show assumes, right, that Donald Trump will be soundly defeated on November 3rd, right? And so we're reimagining the day after. Thinking about your priority list, if you will, what would you place as first, second, and third as it relates to policies that address climate change and undo the damage that has been done?
Definitely. Thanks so much for having me here today. So assuming that we, of course, defeat Donald Trump in November, which is definitely our hope here at 350 Action. 350 Action is our C4 arm of our other organization, 350.org. And so here at 350 Action, we are definitely working towards that. So one of the first things we would really like the new administration to do is, of course, reverse the damage that this current administration has done. Everything from rolling back protections on the National Environmental Policy Act, also known as NEPA, everything from our CAFE standards, which is our fuel efficiency standards for our cars. Both the Bureau of Land Management and EPA methane rules, those were both under attack. The Clean Power Plan that he, was starting to be implemented under the Obama administration, he swiftly reversed. So there's a long list of damage that the current administration has done to our previous well-protected laws. So that would be the first step. After that, just to kind of start with that, is moving forward to be much more aggressive. And so I know that Vice President Biden has come out with a really great list, actually. It's 9 key elements of Joe Biden's plan for a clean energy revolution. And even on this list, he actually lists a lot of things just that I've named that he wants to reverse. Another part, and this was actually part of the campaign as well, is to stop new leases of oil and gas development on public lands. And this has been debated and talked about for a while now, since the Keep It in the Ground bill came out in 2015 from Senator Merkley. And so this has been went from being a bill from 5 years ago to now really being a standard campaign promise for a lot of the Democratic candidates that ran this year. So we're really excited to see that. So I think those are some of the proactive things that he can do. Also starting to really unveil his plan for investment in a just transition for clean energy and how we're actually going to reduce our pollution, as well as what we would really love to see is stopping the federal permitting of new fossil fuel infrastructure. If we are serious about getting to net zero emissions, as well as doing what the IPCC says, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change says is necessary in the next 9 years to avoid the worst effects of climate change, we can't still be building pipelines that are designed to last for the next 50 or 60 years. We can't lock ourselves in to this infrastructure that disrupts our land, water, everything, climate, and then say that we're actually serious about climate change. It doesn't go together. And also it wastes billions of dollars. Why would you want to have stranded assets that are not going to be helpful soon? Why would you want to have stranded? Oh, so there's a little echo there. And so overall, that would be our next step, is put it out there right there through executive order that you're no longer going to give federal permits that are necessary for, especially for like interstate, fossil fuel infrastructure, as well as just other states, things like gas plants, export facilities, things like that. So those would be our ideal kind of top things that we'd like him to do within the first 100 days for sure.
What's the, Natalie, can I ask you just a follow up on that? How deep into the federal bureaucracy over the past 4 years has the Trump administration been able to place anti-science people who are going to be, and have you discovered the civil service jobs, even though they were political appointees? I mean, what's it going to take to weed out the anti-climate, anti-science crowd from all these different agencies?
Interesting. That is kind of tough, because a lot of times these agencies are career people that are there from different administrations, but of course he can also place in some. I think that honestly, if there is a political appointment that has been in there from the Trump administration, it would be up to the new Biden administration to see who they feel like can really stay and who's actually doing their job and who really was just there to implement the policies of the president to deny science. Overall, I don't think it would be too much of an issue, because there is usually a big, flow of people in and out of Washington every election, every time there's a new administration. So overall, I think they would probably replace the top positions for sure. And then the smaller, more career positions are usually people who are just kind of there as their regular federal employees that I don't think would be too much of an issue.
Right. No, I was worried. I'm worried more about what we've seen in the past, where a departing administration in the last 6 months places a whole bunch of people, and then there's a process through which they actually get them to be transformed from political appointees to civil service and career, and then then the new Secretary of Interior or the Secretary of Energy or the head of EPA is stuck with them. Maybe it's not as serious a problem as I'm imagining, but it seems like a big problem. Just one last thing before I go back to Abby. On day one, after the inauguration, if there was one thing that you would like Biden to announce, what would it be? Rejoining Paris?
I would say, I would have to be a lot of things. I feel like I feel like, this is exactly what President Trump did in his first day. He just started in his first week, started signing executive order after executive order. I would say that we want him to do everything that he can do immediately with executive order. In fact, on his list of the 9 key elements, he actually has a list of things that he would do with executive order on day one, which some of them are things like banning new leases of fossil fuels on public lands, which is immediate because that's just implemented by the Secretary of the Interior. Also, he says in here that he would permanently protect the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, which is a big deal. People have been trying to drill there for over 30 years. And so I think actually from his list here, I would want him to do all of them because it literally is just a signature and they can have them written up before. So
Good.
all of these things he lists, I think, would show us that he's being serious.
Bill Finch, what about the cities? And when you were head of the Climate and Task Force, the Climate and Jobs Task Force for all the U.S. mayors across the country, didn't you do something to try to globalize that? Didn't you work with cities from other countries as well?
Yeah, I have to say the U.S. Conference of Mayors has been in the lead on this since day one. I mean, the mayor's climate protection pledge that they took starting in 2005, I think it was first announced in 2007, had 1,100 mayors sign on to this, led by Greg Nichols, the famous mayor of Seattle, who got it all started. Mayors have so much that they can do. And Mike Bloomberg's working with the 60 largest cities. But they used to say about Bridgeport that after Vaudeville, everything's Bridgeport, right? After New York City, everything's Bridgeport. There's thousands of cities like Bridgeport around the world. And our carbon impact and the impact on the environment from within our boundaries is great. And no one can act as quickly as mayors can. Sometimes they don't have as many resources, but they have a lot of resources. And they also are generally not running against each other. So they like to steal each other's ideas and replicate quickly. So I think one of the messages I have on this show, Toby, as in answer to your question, is we have underutilized mayors. Mayors have been the first responders on climate since day one. And there's so much they can do. And we looked just at Bridgeport and what we did. ICLEI studied our climate impact of the city's activities. It was only 4% of the overall total. So when we did our Be Green 2020 sustainability plan, which I would urge every city to do and just replicate what Bridgeport and New York City did with Plan YC and Be Green 2020, we found that we had to get the business community involved. So we formed a partnership with the Chamber of Commerce, which was, everybody thinks the Chamber is your enemy. The Chamber is not your enemy because they see jobs and reduced expenses and greater efficiencies in the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. So we raised several $100,000 over several years, augmented the city staff, created a sustainability director, and had a plan of action of 65 policies, which we implemented all of them. Actually, we didn't implement one. That's another story. But we reduced the greenhouse gas emissions within the city of Bridgeport's boundaries, this is pretty amazing, by 5%. We had the equivalent of 20,000 homes on renewable energy. That's a significant percentage of Bridgeport's number of homes. So if Bridgeport can do it, any city could do it because we're a broke city in the Northeast with lots of challenges. But we created about $1 billion, over $1 billion of investment in 8 years. The thing that I like to focus on is a triple bottom line. We shouldn't do anything that doesn't reduce the city's expense, create jobs in the inner city, jobs that can't be exported overseas, and reduce our impact on the climate with greenhouse gas emissions. So if you do a policy that has all of those, everybody, what did Kennedy say, that success has got 1 million fathers and failure is an orphan? You have a lot of fathers who want to take credit for what you can do.
Great. Ab?
Yeah, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about those partnerships that you created with businesses, because I think often we see business, we as in progressive organizations, progressive organizers, and activists do see business as a threat to the progress that we can make on climate change, on environmental justice, right? And there is a real concern as well about how did we get started here, and a lot of activists would say it is because of business practices. It is because of environmental racism. So I'd love to hear, how you address that, how you worked with businesses.
Well, on the last point you made about environmental racism, which is clearly the case, we had our environmental justice community front and center in our whole planning of the sustainability plan. So we didn't do anything that didn't impact the quality of life. And, one thing that mayors can do is they can talk turkey, right? They don't go in and talk about penguins and polar bears and degrees Celsius and Fahrenheit. They go in and say, Aunt Millie's basement is flooding. Joe doesn't have a job. My son's got asthma. We relate it to people where they're at and what their conditions that they're living under are. And by doing that, we reach the hearts of people and the minds of people. We had 100 kids out every summer in something called the Mayor's Conservation Corps. They taught people how to recycle. They taught people how to work with Posigen to get solar on their roof. We taught people how to use the buses. We taught every green practice you can imagine with kids from the community, providing them a summer job. How to get a free tree from the city for your yard so we can sequester carbon. I believe that mayors can do a tremendous amount. And they just need to, I think one of the faults of the environmental community worldwide is they haven't reached out to mayors enough. I think Bloomberg's doing a great job with his C40. I just said 60 before, it's C40. But beyond the 40 largest cities, what I was explaining with Natalie earlier when we spoke was every time a mayor finds a better way to lend a library book or fill a pothole or create affordable housing or create jobs in the inner city, they're fighting climate change, because the more dense we live, the shorter the distance to transport ourselves to work, our sewage to the treatment center, our electrons to our cell phone. All those distances require less energy, which means they require less greenhouse gas emissions. So a huge amount of conservation is making cities work and to expand the number of people that live close to one another. Now, COVID has given us some challenges in that regard, but I think it's also showed us how interdependent we are in each other.
Can I ask both of our guests to focus on the morning of November 4th? And you wake up and Trump is defeated, and hopefully he will have been called the winner before we even get 2 time zones away from the East Coast. But let's just say he wins decisively. It's not hard to come up with a whole bunch of things that need to be fixed, repaired, rebuilt, reimagined. Natalie went over a good list of them. What 1 or 2 things you think about, light bulb goes on and you say, this is a really big opportunity right now to move us forward beyond where we would have been? In other words, what are the lessons, if any, that have been learned from these monstrous policies that then give us a maybe more enlightened citizenry to work with? Natalie?
All right. Well, in terms of the lessons learned, I mean, I don't know if everyone has learned them. I don't think that necessarily, a lot of times, I don't think the general public is necessarily paying attention to things like the rollbacks of the National Environmental Policy Act or things like that. I think that people see the difference as we were talking about it with Bill, is that they see the impacts on themselves. And so I think what people have seen just from disastrous policies overall, I mean, look at the state we're in right now with the pandemic. That is something that you cannot deny. You cannot not be affected by it. And the fact that our entire economy is being held hostage right now because of it. And if, all the reports have already said, if every American wore a mask when they went out, we could have this under control in the next 1 to 2 months. And that's so simple. That seems like the easiest solution that we could ever do. So I think that the fact that his lack of leadership at the top and questioning the masks and, supporting doctors that don't know what they're talking about. You've seen some things he's posted about putting up the statements that are not real, that until we have a leader that actually leads based on science, that actually leads based on what is real, then a lot of the American people are not going to follow through. And so I would say those are the examples of the disastrous policies that I think people are starting to pay attention to. But overall, I don't know if everyone has noticed the different environmental rollbacks, because he's been doing them for the last almost 4 years, and they haven't slowed down at all. I would say that we've learned too that any policy we create has to be based on the science. It's not, political science does not matter. The only thing that matters is physical science. And yet we keep legislating as if we can make up physics, like we can give our opinion on what's real and think that that's going to make it real. And so my biggest push would be for the next administration to make laws and to overall have policies based on the physical science of what we need to do.
I would say The president will only be as successful to the extent that he works with mayors. And we've got to remember, Trump just didn't fall out of the sky. He was elected because of fear, racial fear, economic fear, racial supremacy, misogyny. He played on everyone's fears, right? And he got there because he played on their fears. We have to play to people's aspirations. And you have to work with mayors to work to build the foundation that then the states and the national government, the national government hasn't done much of anything to fight climate change. Thankfully, Al Gore led the effort, and President Obama was a courageous leader to get us into the Paris Accord. But the Paris Accord is not enough. We can talk about that at some point in another show, perhaps, about how we need more than the Paris Accord, and we're not even in that. So I think we have to remember that Trump didn't fall out of the sky, and we have foundational work that the mayors can be key on. If every mayor had a mayor's conservation corps that went door to door with kids from the community, teaching people about how we should relate to nature, we have nature deficit disorder. We don't have people understanding where their food comes from, where their water comes from, where their electrons come from. And as a result of not having that, they don't understand science. And as a result of not understanding science, we get off on these, Twitter wars that don't really mean anything. But one thing that I would like to point out is in the Biden-Harris, I said Harris-Biden, I'm sorry, Biden-Harris, Biden-Harris.
Tell us how you really feel.
Interchangeable, I like it. The first point is basically the Hippocratic Oath, do no harm. Undo all the harm that Trump did, which is legion. But the second thing he points out, and I just want to read it, is the legislation that he proposes must require polluters to bear the full cost of carbon pollution they are submitting. So in Connecticut, we were lucky. We had Dodd pushing carbon tax, we had Lieberman pushing cap and trade, and the Bushes supported cap and trade. And then we got off onto this partisan war where we denied science. We got to get back to that. Biden has to reach across the aisle and have this be bipartisan, and mayors can do that because mayors, in some cases, don't even run with a party. So I would say Biden will be successful to the extent he involves mayors and helps build that foundation that we've got to rebuild, because we've had 4 years of saying that the town green sucks and government's ripping you off and those people are the problem. And we've got to get back to joining hands, understanding our role in nature, understanding how we need to relate to our natural environment so that we don't poison our own spaceship. This is a spaceship that we're on, spaceship Earth. And we don't have the support mechanisms properly. I used to run a science museum, and we had a room that was just like the Skylab, just like the space station. And in the space station, all these things are replicated in the museum, where you monitor the air, you monitor the water, you monitor everyone's health, you monitor everyone's temperature, you monitor everything in this little environment. And you think, well, why aren't we doing that to our planet? Why aren't we monitoring all the inputs and outputs and making sure? So I think the point I want to make is he has to work with mayors, and he has to price carbon. If the environment continues to be a cesspool, free to dumping of climate gases, climate changing gases, we'll continue to dump if there's not a price on it. You have to price carbon.
Right.
So
we have go ahead, Ab.
Oh,
Sorry.
no. So, this is something I've been wondering since Donald Trump was elected. But, on November 3rd, even if we elect Biden and Harris, there are still going to be people who supported Donald Trump, who did everything they could to keep him in power. And these are still the people who are very susceptible to misinformation, right? And so I'm wondering, how do we address that? What messaging are we using? I know, Bill, you started talking about education, but these people exist now, right? And it's hard to penetrate at this point to cut through all of that false noise. And so I'm just wondering your thoughts on that. And what have you all been doing to address that?
Well, when we had the Mayor's Conservation Corps, and we had kids from the community with a summer job trained on how to explain climate change, how to explain your impact to nature and how to mitigate against that, it worked. We built new parks, and we showed how a water play area and a park, we had an eco-technology park where we encouraged green businesses to move in. And then when they moved in, we taught the public why a job creating porous pavement would save them tax revenue, because the groundwater would be recharged naturally rather than run off into the sewer system, where we have to spend tremendous amounts of money and energy taking the clean rainwater out of the sewage system. So much of this gets back to fundamental operations of government that mayors know. I know how to take clean rainwater and prevent it from being polluted by sewage and then having to burn fossil fuels to get rid of it. Do you know that by the time I dry out the sewage, it's still 80% water? Then I ship it to a burn plant in New Haven, and it's burnt, and it's still 30% water. Why did I get the rainwater in there in the first place? Why am I spending all this fossil fuel? So we've got things that mayors know, but we need to empower them. The greatest thing that Obama did for mayors was the energy efficiency block grant. And unfortunately, they only did it for 1 year. But mayors reduced their carbon impact tremendously by weatherizing buildings and helping residents weatherize their buildings and making boilers more efficient and all the like things that they did with that money. You need to put that on steroids and get that money into the local government, because the magnitude of what mayors can do with much less money than the federal and state government is enormous.
Let me ask. That's great, Bill. Let me ask Natalie what might be called a movement question. So I noticed on the 350 website, very impressive arranging of a series called Solidarity School, I think it is, right? And they're on different topics, and it's all very impressive. And then there's one on November 11th that is something about holding politicians accountable, which is sort of right up your alley, I think. My view, and this is not based on huge amount of knowledge, but my relationship with the environmental groups, environmental community over the years, and I do a lot of pro bono work for the big organizations. How does climate as an issue get to the top of the priority list with all the other stuff that's going on? I'm a newly elected member of Congress I'm a member-elect on November 4th. People are coming at me from all directions. What does the climate movement look like in that, on that landscape versus what more people might consider bread and butter issues, healthcare, education, and so forth? And how do you get climate to prevail as an issue in that noise that'll be going on?
Definitely. So, of course, as a newly elected official, everyone wants to meet with them. Everyone wants to talk to them and say, my issue is the most important. My issue is the most important. The thing with climate change is, tell me one thing on Earth that climate doesn't affect. Tell me a plant that it doesn't affect, an animal doesn't affect, a human it doesn't affect. It is the only issue that affects every living thing on this planet. So if somebody says, well, I care more about this other thing, you should care about your health. And I care about the air I breathe that affects my health. I care about the asthma that I've had since I was diagnosed at 3 that has affected my entire life. And so I don't think you can ever separate it. Climate or environment or both is simply your entire world. Everything that you breathe in, everything that you drink, everything that you do. And so it's not a matter of separating the issues. If you're talking about even with education, what are you teaching children? What you teach them, just like what Bill said, if there's not an understanding of where their resources come from, or where their food comes from, or where their electricity comes from, then you're raising a population that is going to argue if a mask gives you coronavirus. That happened last week. I don't know if anybody saw that. Somebody texted to me, and that was what Representative Gomer was arguing when it came out that he had coronavirus. And he argued from one of the fake doctors or so that Trump had tweeted about, said something about, you have a mask on and you breathe in your own coronavirus that's already there and it gives it to you. It was like, what? And so if you don't have proper education, you're going to have people that we can't even get past the pandemic because people say the mask is dangerous. So it's all connected. You cannot leave one out. And I think that also climate education in schools is very important. There shouldn't be a single person that is debating if climate change is happening or if it's real. I mean, I learned the carbon cycle, I'm pretty sure, in 3rd grade. And I mean, I think I could explain it by 4th grade. So why are we still discussing it?
A lot of that goes out the window, though, right? And that's why mayors are so critical. I could not go to the grocery store. I could not pump gas without somebody asking me something for a favor, for a tree limb, for a cat barking, dog bark.
You were going out, yeah.
When mayors talk to people, they cut through all that noise. They cut through that stuff. And it's not an argument about whether I saw it on Twitter or it's science or it's not science. It's, I need help right now. And mayors can, if properly trained, and most of them are, cut through all that noise. If your mayor tells you to get a vaccine, it's the most likely elected official you're going to listen to.
Yeah,
Congress members go to the grocery store all the time and nobody knows who they are. Senator Gillibrand can go down the middle of Main Street and people aren't going to stop her. But if the mayor does, there's going to be people grabbing at your shirt sleeve. So again, I got to harp on this. Every administration I've ever been involved with does not emphasize mayors. You know, I'm talking to Kevin McCarty at the U.S. Conference of Mayors, and he says mayors are the first responders of climate. We're the ones that have to say it's about your flooded basement. It's about Uncle Joe not having a job. It's not being able to pay your light bill. Your kid's got asthma. That's climate change. And if we relate that and we keep it positive, improving the people's quality of life, not saying you're bad, you're doing this, if you don't stop doing this, if you don't stop eating meat, if we start that way, we lose the argument because the other side says, don't listen to them. It's all fake news. Eat your meat.
And that's very important to say that. I think it's, of course, how you communicate these issues. I think that, as Bill said, if you are communicating these issues in a way that makes it relate to people's lives, right, and making sure they understand that, you know, climate touches every single part of their lives. And so I think for me, in terms of what is our plan in terms of holding elected officials accountable after they win, is if we're pushing for an elected official, whether we've endorsed them or whatever their stance is, we already kind of know where they're at when they get elected. You know, we're very much pushing for them to have plans made before as they're running. And once you know where someone's at, say they're elected and they're a champion. For example, Jamal Bauman was recently won his primary, expected to win the general. He was one of our 350 Action endorsements as well. If you already know that they're on the path fighting for a Green New Deal, fighting for clean energy for all, fighting for a just transition, then it's not really so much even holding them accountable. It's helping them fulfill what they want to do. It's coming to them in the first month after they've been inaugurated and saying, look, we want to help you. Here are some bills that you can work on. How can we work together? And what I found is half of lobbying isn't really trying to persuade people as much as it is trying to be a resource for them to help them do what they already plan on doing. And that's really what 350 Action does, is once we help you, hopefully get elected, our C3 side, 350.org, will also meet with you and say, this is how we can work together in the environmental movement. And then for also candidates who get elected who maybe aren't with us on everything, you don't give up on them. You can't. You still need them. There's still a vote that is necessary. And so meeting with them regularly and pulling them in to show ways that they can still be better. And just understanding that this is politics. Not everyone's going to be with you all the time, but as long as you move those who are already on your side to take action, you can actually do enough to make the big difference and get some laws passed.
Well, one of the things that happens on November 4th is the transition begins, right? To what extent are climate activists being invited to be part of the transition as opposed to standing on the sideline?
Natalie and I are ready to go.
Oh yeah, definitely. I think it depends on the different orgs.
You tell the time and place, we'll be there.
Yeah, I think it depends on the orgs, but a lot of organizations are already involved in the campaign in many ways, right? If they have C4 and they can endorse. And then it's sort of more of a seamless transition of, okay, well, let's help really build your cabinet. Let's help you build recommendations for high posts, whether it's EPA administrator, whether it's the head of CEQ, which is the Council of Environmental Quality, and all these different positions that a lot of times people do come from the environmental movement. And sometimes they go to the environmental movement once they leave office. There are people I used to meet with at my previous position who were high level people in CEQ, right? Which is the executive branch's sort of climate arm, right? And when the administration ended, they went right into environmental nonprofits. And that's totally fine. It's because we already know as environmentalists the laws. We already know what we're pushing for. We already know when the Trump administration and Congress with their CRA, Congressional Review Act, messed up they went after the BLM methane rules, which that vote failed. But the administration later took actions against these methane rules that the Obama administration had finalized soon before they left. And we knew that was going to be a target. So it's not like we didn't know that was going to happen once the administration changed. And so that's really how we do it, is I think being a part of the transition of helping provide those resources of expertise so that those positions can be filled with the best people. And I expect the same thing to happen after, in November, if we have a Biden-Harris win.
Mm-hmm. So we have a couple of questions coming from the audience right now. So I'll ask a few and feel free to, whoever it makes sense to respond. But one of those questions is around climate change disproportionately impacting Indigenous communities, both in the US and around the world. And so how are we ensuring that we are prioritizing these communities within the climate change movement moving forward? And I'll say I'm from Louisiana, and we are losing our land very, very quickly. And we have Indigenous communities there that have seen just such a rapid loss of land, and along with that loss of land comes loss of culture and tradition, and then they have to figure out where to move, and the government is not supporting them. So how can we center these voices?
I will go jump in there. I'm really happy you asked that, because you're absolutely right. And, climate refugees, which is exactly what a lot of folks in this, South Louisiana are. Their land is literally disappearing. And so climate refugees are real. They're all over the world, and they usually impact the most vulnerable populations in each country. And we know that for different countries around the world, including our own, some of the most vulnerable populations are our Indigenous communities. And so I think for, Voya 350 Action, 350.org as well, is we work very closely with everything from Indigenous Environmental Network, Standing Rock Sioux Tribe, and really working in partnership. I think what we have to look at it as, colonization didn't end. It didn't stop just because, okay, well, now we have this nation state with this title. Colonization is still occurring. When you go into an Indigenous community and say, we're just going to take your land and build a pipeline through it, that's still colonization. That's still saying that this other, and that's private companies. Private companies now can do that. And so, and with the consent of the US government, eminent domain, all these things. So in the end, essentially, we are still colonizing lands that have been taken a long time ago, but now we're taking them for fossil fuel projects. And so I think one of the ways that we prioritize Indigenous communities is, one, working directly with leaders of Indigenous communities. There are different environmental organizations and other organizations, but also highlighting the fact that these communities are targeted. It's not by accident. They're not looking for typically a white, wealthy community to build a pipeline through, because they're afraid that there'll be too much pushback, too much political power, and that it wouldn't be easy. And so the fact that they're targeting communities that are already the most vulnerable is the same racism that has always existed. And I think highlighting that and speaking of it, and not thinking that these pipelines are just built because that was the best route. They're built in what they feel like is going to be the easiest route to get what they want. And that is same thing as colonization and racism. And so here at 350, and I'm sure many, many other orgs, is actually centering the work that is occurring there in those communities that are already being attacked. And same thing with Black and Brown communities for pollution. Climate change and other pollution does not just affect everyone equally. It affects everyone, but it doesn't affect everyone equally. If you think of Cancer Alley, you mentioned Louisiana, Cancer Alley, also known as Death Alley, it's the series of miles of nothing but infrastructure of different types of chemical plants, refineries, and they concentrated it in an area that they thought, well, no one will care about. And I think that you cannot have climate justice and environmental justice without actually knowing what your work is. Your work is racial justice, because if there wasn't racism, you would not have the climate crisis, because you can't have the climate crisis unless you have areas that everybody is comfortable with letting die in order to have these fossil fuel impacts. And so I think that's the main thing, is centering your work on racial justice. And if you are centering it on racial justice, you will also have environmental justice.
So before I go to the next question from an audience member, I was wondering, Bill, if you had a response to that, any additional thoughts there?
Well, when we did Be Green 2020, it was basically a three-way partnership between the city, the business community, and the citizens. And front and foremost among the citizenry was the environmental justice leaders. So we did that consciously, because we know we have a lot of reparations to make up. And we also know that climate change disproportionately will affect the have-nots, not the haves. I look out my window here, and just up the street is the smallest Indian reservation in the United States. It's a 1/4 acre. The Pawcatuck tribe, which I went to school with a couple of kids from the Pawcatuck tribe. There's only a few of them here. We've pushed them to a 1/4 acre. They used to own most of the greater Bridgeport area. If anybody has any doubt about how racist our ancestors were toward the Native American population, they need to read "Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee." We did every bit as bad things as the Nazis did. We did it to people we considered subhuman, and it was a despicable part of our past. And we do have, if anyone has a conscience, we do have reparations to make. But I would say that nothing. I would like to just echo what Natalie said. Nothing we can do can be done without addressing this issue and addressing the disproportionate impacts that poor people worldwide. I mean, 80% of the people in Bangladesh living at or near or below the sea level. Imagine what sea level rise is going to do to some of the poorest people on earth in Bangladesh.
Mm-hmm.
This is something we all have to be concerned about. And I think what COVID did is it taught us that just like a virus, we are all in this together. We can transmit the disease, and we're transmitting climate change disease as well.
I think one of the things that has impressed us about the 350 activities is we've all been involved in the great groups, EDF, National Resources Defense Council, on more political level, legal conservation voters, but 350 is really has a great global perspective, and that obviously why you were able to answer so well, Natalie, the question about indigenous populations. We mentioned Paris sort of fleetingly, but in terms of getting our arms around the climate issue before it's too late, how much of your activity is non-U.S. and truly global, would you say?
So in 350 as a whole, so for my work, I'm the U.S. policy director. So I exclusively work on U.S. But as 350 is a global org, we are located in all continents, of course, except Antarctica. So we are all over the world. I think that in terms of our global, I'd have to get the exact numbers of staff, but most of our staff, when I think about our U.S. staff versus in terms of numbers and our rest of our staff, most of our staff is outside of the U.S. Just that it's not that I think our U.S. programs are likely our biggest programs, but I think most of our staff overall spread out is around the world. And I mean, I think the reason why 350, as it was created 10 years ago, was a global org is because this is a global problem. We can't really say we want to get to 350 parts per million in America. That doesn't work, right? Climate change doesn't center on one place. We have to globally work together to get the 350 parts per million, which is the highest level of carbon in the atmosphere that is safe for human civilization. And right now, we're measured, the last time it was checked about not too long ago, less than a year ago, was at 415 parts per million.
Right.
And so it's increasing, obviously. And I think that having the global perspective and being able to work across the world, even as one org, it's really helpful. We even had a all staff meeting today, and it was, people from all over the world, and they have to do they do one at 3 a.m. and then they do one at 10 o'clock or 11 o'clock this morning. So to match the time zones. And so we have to, make those accommodations. Obviously, the global team might be a little tired when they have to do presentations at 3 a.m. for them, but depending on where they're located. And it really helps in that unification, being in the all staff meeting today and seeing my colleagues who, most I haven't met because they're all over, but knowing that we're all working together for the same common goal of achieving 350 parts per million. And I think that's really the way to go. I think it's kind of like, of course, start with the country you live in, right? You have to worry about the plank in your own eye, right? Before you take the speck out of your neighbor's eye. And the U.S. disproportionately pollutes significantly higher. We are at less than 5% of the world population, and we produce about 15% of global climate emissions. We're punching 3 times our weight. We're in our different weight class here. And that has been the historic way that it's been for decades and decades and decades. So we have the most work to do because historically we have been the largest polluters. And so I'm happy to be able to, of course, work as part of the US team because it's my home, but also it is the greatest need in terms of our government that is still debating climate change. So I think it's always good to start local at home and then, of course, work with a global perspective.
Abby's going to wrap us up here in a minute, but just on that note, we had a question earlier that didn't get to the stage, and it involved it was a global question with other leaders, Trump-like leaders. Let's take Bolsonaro.
I was like, as soon as you said Trump-like leaders, I was like,
the best and worst example.
Who are we going to pick?
What do you anticipate will be the impact of a decisive Trump loss on Bolsonaro? My understanding is his popularity is very, very low. Oh. He's a climate denier, science denier, like Trump.
Trump of the South.
Yeah. So what's your view on that? I mean, he would be the most notorious, right? Outside the US.
It would alienate him. I hope he would feel like he has no friends in this world. I hope he would feel like a complete abject failure that he is. I hope he would realize that the whole world is laughing at him and obviously Trump, but now he doesn't even have Trump to rely on of taking most of the laughter of the world. And I hope that it would wake up, obviously, people in Brazil to be like, you know what, we tried this experiment. This was terrible. Let's not do this again. And I hope America has the same realization very soon. But there's no guarantees. Every country, they say all politics are local, right? I don't think the U.S. elections, I don't think people are thinking about Bolsonaro in the U.S. elections. I think they're just thinking about what's affecting their life, their day to day. And that's expected. So hopefully that would be a tipping point for the world to understand that fascism is not the way to go. That also was tried before and that didn't work well. So let's stop trying it and let's invest in communities and freedom and also obviously a just transition for this world.
Thank you both. Abby?
Thank you all. That's all the time we have for today. We hope you enjoyed the discussion and we hope you'll continue it with your fellow citizens. And thank you to our guests for joining us.
Glad to be here.
Please keep in touch via Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter for news on our upcoming shows. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks.
Really appreciate it.
Same here.